Nayia Yiakoumaki, Vassilios Doupas and Foote, thank you very much indeed for your time. I'm really delighted to have you all here talking about Queer Spaces London 1980s to today at the Whitechapel Gallery, London. So this exhibition is a result of a research program led by the University College of London Urban Laboratory, which examined the closure of queer LGBTQ plus spaces in London between 2006 and 2016. And a lot of the results, the research material and the survey results were quite astonishing to me whilst reading through this week. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about this, unpack some of these issues and how you've dealt and handled some of the materials and the exhibition objects. Firstly, I'd like to ask you all, and you can all comment sort of separately or exchange comments with each other, how you've encountered and dealt with the objects, archival objects, but also the artist's objects here during the course of the curatorial process in this exhibition.
Sure, I can start if you're fine with it. I slide a correction to what you said, is that this exhibition is not a result in a way of the research that Urban Lab did, although their research is extremely pivotal to this exhibition. It has informed. So we started researching the proposal that came from Vassilios, and along the way, we both actually at different moments came across that research. And to be curatorially honest, we thought there's no point of reinventing the wheel when there's such a profound research that's already been done. And then we invited Ben Campkin and Urban Lab to contribute. So how we approached the material, I don't know, I can speak personally, but I think curatorially we were very actually united that we're against hierarchies within material themselves, first of all. So from whether they are from informal sources, formal, original, tweeting, printouts of tweets, and the artworks, we feel that they work together in bringing a very different approach. How the artist approach it is very different from how the historian or the archivist approach it, but they all in a way contribute to an alternative historiography in the end. So we make reference to them. In that sense, we saw the exhibition as sort of interrelated, with interrelated parts. And we selected the artists also with what political impact their work may have, how vocal their work is in relation to the issues we were addressing. And we used the same methodology for selecting the archive material. There was hundreds of them, and Urban Lab had, in a way, proposed numerous case studies, but we then selected the ones we have, and the material we put into the audience. And it's important for the visitor who knows a lot and who doesn't know anything about it. We have to be mindful of both visitors, both types of visitors. We were taking a journalist around the other day, just yesterday came to see who has been in the London Lesbian and Gay Centre numerous times. He knew much more than we did because it closed so many years ago, and so he had also a very interesting experience together with someone who will walk in tomorrow and has never heard of it. We think that was the aim.
I think two things to add to what Nayia said is that we wanted an exhibition that brings together archival material but also works by artists. And then we want this exhibition to be intergenerational. So we have had Tom Burr's work, who has been working with these issues for 3 decades, from the 80s onwards, with artists that are a lot younger than we are. And we thought it would be interesting to see how they approach this subject, because obviously we have lived through some of these venues, but they haven't. So it's interesting to see what is myth and what is reality and what impact it had on them growing up from a different generation, where the internet generation, whereas we're quite older.
Digital.
Not that older.
Not all.
Not all.
Also mature.
Right. Yeah. And in terms of how we encountered some of this archive material, obviously we were working very closely with UCL's Urban Laboratory. But really, in assembling the exhibition, it was a real collaborative effort with a really wide range of different people who were involved in either directly with the venues or as kind of archivists working at places like Bishopsgate Institute or the Hall Carpenter Archives, where they're undertaking kind of quite activist archival processes, bringing things into the archive which wouldn't typically be there. If it's like old editions of gay magazines or lesbian magazines or queer subject matter or protest banners, we were able to draw on their kind of knowledge and generosity in sharing that material. But we also worked with individuals who themselves have been working in some of the venues, so such as Veronica Mackenzie, who is currently doing a project looking at the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre, which was in Peckham, running in the late 80s and 90s. And she's done some amazing work, not just bringing together some of the paper kind of remnants of this project, of which there aren't too many, but she's also been undertaking an amazing survey, interviewing many of the people who remember this space, and created a documentary which is on display in the exhibition. So we're really benefiting from this huge collaborative effort and these different examples of people sharing their work with us.
Their expertise.
And I think this theme of collaboration comes through the exhibition as well.
Yes, indeed it does. Yeah, it's really interesting to see the archival material with the works of art by all these artists and contributing artists. I think it's also very interesting that the period that you guys chose to deal with all this material, 1980s Britain and the Margaret Thatcher, which was particularly challenging for LGBTQ plus communities. And of course, as a result, there was a lot of transgressive subculture created from those communities to counter Thatcherism. Through the 90s, Tony Blair, we all had a lot of money and credit.
Pink pound.
Well, exactly, pink pound. And then through, obviously, the ruthless 2008 recession, which is still creating a lot of products and some of which is austerity. So it's a very rich period. How do you all see, you as curators, talking about LGBTQ history within such a rich period and diverse within, Britain? For instance, we're talking about before Clause 28, that was still active until 2006, you said, right? I think Tony Blair abolished it. So how do you feel about this, dealing with such a sort of rich period, diverse?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been remarkable is that engaging with this history is, on the one hand, we have these really stark reminders of the political climate in the 1980s. For example, in the display case about the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, we've got some material from Gay's the Word bookshop, which was is still around. It's celebrating this year its 40th anniversary. But they had a bookshop branch as part of the centre, and it opened just at the time when their main branch was raided by the UK Customs and Excise Office, and they seized over a third of their stock, and causing this kind of lengthy legal battle over 2 years, which they did eventually win, reclaiming the stock, which was kind of damaged in some cases, and then reselling the stock with these kind of amazing stickers which say seized book, so you kind of use the book as a kind of symbol of that struggle. But it did mean that their branch had to close as part of the London Lesbian and Gay Centre. But it's also interesting how today different struggles continue about preserving and protecting and re-providing spaces. So in a certain sense, many things have changed, but some things haven't changed.
Stay the same,
Yeah, and in general, just to say that this period that we focused in, which was because of the political changes and even the prejudice in the early 80s, we lived here. I was here in the 80s in Britain during Thatcher, just a couple of years, and then the change to Major and also we have a memory in a way because of our age of those years, but also it's a period that a lot of audiences can relate to, whether they're younger or older, but they can all remember and relate. It's not a historicising
first-hand
it.
experience.
Yeah.
We were going to the clubs at the
But it's
time.
interesting to see the very young LGBTQ plus people now looking back and sort of examining Thatcher's government in relation to the community.
For us, it's not a historical period. It's actually a prolonged current period, in that sense. And so,
but I think it does mark the beginning of neoliberal tactics, and that really impacted how we see public space, how we see society, how we look at communities, and these are all questions that this exhibition is posing.
No, absolutely. I think that there's a big discussion out there about neoliberalism is creating consumers as opposed to citizens.
Yeah. I mean, I think to my mind, the 80s was a decade of greed and excess, and there's no such thing as a community, basically.
No, it's all about the individual.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
So I would like to sort of focus a little bit more on the report that UCL produced. So the report findings suggest that though there has been generally an increasing number of bars and pubs closing down across the city, there's even a higher percentage of LGBTQ plus venues closing down. So since 2006, the number of LGBTQ plus venues in London has fallen from 125 to 53, a net loss of 58% of venues. This is pretty shocking, and I've witnessed some of these venues closing down, such as the Nelson's Head, the Georgian Dragon, the Joiners Arms, because I'm a local here. In your view, what are the main reasons behind the sharp rise in LGBTQ plus venues closures?
Well, I think some of the reasons might be reasons that a lot of other venues are disappearing and a lot of community venues are disappearing, or independent shops are disappearing. And this is in a way due to a massive redevelopment of the city that puts profit before people, and we see it everywhere. My experience is if I'm away from London for 3 months, I come back to a different city sometimes, a different neighborhood. And so I think, this was a main reason. Then perhaps the queer communities were not using venues for socializing only, so the political and self-organizing aspect was obviously suppressed by the developers. This wasn't important anymore. If it wasn't a socializing venue or a club, perhaps they felt it was unsuccessful in its service.
Unsuccessful business.
Unsuccessful business, exactly. And so maybe this was one reason. But luckily we understand from the research that they have stabilized in the last 1.5 to 2 years, which is interesting, perhaps change of policy.
I mean, I would also mention the changes in the LGBTQ plus community. So I think now, because a lot of things have changed in society and they are widely accepted, or they are seem to be widely accepted, with gay marriage and whatever that entails, legally, but also in terms of social values. I think the community doesn't feel the reason to go to these spaces anymore, to interact with their kind, if you want. So I think it's becoming much more heteronormative. They don't see the reason why they should be using different spaces, why they should single themselves out from existing bars, pubs, entertainment venues. So I think there's also a shadow there.
Yes.
Yeah, and we're very lucky to work with Ben Campkin from UCL Urban Laboratory, who produced this report. And what's been interesting as part of gathering the materials for this exhibition is, in the last couple of years, some of the activist campaigns that we've been looking at in the exhibition, such as the Friends of the Joiners Arms or the Black Cap campaign, have been able to draw on that data and use it in kind of planning discussions, working with the local authorities. So we're very lucky to have that kind of insight, and also talking a bit with Ben about this report that he produced. I think the point that you raise about how it particularly affected the LGBTQ plus community, this development, I think it does come out in that report, and it's interesting that, it's unfortunate that a lot of the kind of the spaces which have catered for kind of women and people of colour have been more kind of event-based, and they have had less access to the resources to set up permanent spaces, and they have been kind of disproportionately affected by these changes, and I think it's really important to highlight that aspect of the changing picture in the
No,
current
absolutely. And I think there's leading on from this question and your answer, I also think about the impact of technology. With smartphones, dating and sex apps have had a huge dramatic impact in LGBTQ plus culture and nightlife. Nowadays we all live like this on our phones whilst walking on the high street, and people perhaps feel that there isn't much need to go out and socialise because you can find everything on your phone. What are your thoughts on it, the impact of technology?
I think it's very different actually from these spaces, in the sense that these spaces were there to socialise and to be yourself and to explore yourself. Obviously there were different times, whereas most of these applications are about hooking up. So they are dating applications for sex. It's the same as when you order fast food. So you consume it, okay, and that's it, and that your appetite is satisfied. But when you go to a restaurant, you go there because you want to engage in the atmosphere of the restaurant, to have some sort of casual conversation with the person serving you, to see your friends, to get together.
To be part of.
Yes, and I think this get together is crucial when we talk about these spaces, and that's why, going back to your question, we think this idea of collaboration is coming through this exhibition here.
Well, that's a very important point. However, I would argue that remember the days before smartphones and apps and Instagram and Facebook, all that, healthier days, I suppose. Many people would argue that people would go out, as you said, I think most people, to socialise and meet their own community, their own group of people and friends, and have fun, dance. I think music played a huge part in it. But some people would also go out to find sex, and on their own, and which is perfectly fine. But nowadays, those people don't feel compelled anymore to go out to find sex. They can stay at home. There's a much more individualistic experience, and that's what kind of, in a way, worries me about the sort of advance of technology and digital era.
I mean, one of the great things about technology is that you can also reinvent yourself. So you can come up with different persona. You can have a digital persona, and you can actually present yourself the way you would like to be. And I'm not talking about being delusional. I'm talking about, maybe the dissolution of gender, or maybe becoming more fluid in terms of your political, social, whatever ideas. So there's, I don't want to ditch that. I don't want to say, gay apps are bad, you shouldn't use them, go out to the bars. There's an element which I think is really, really important. But obviously, when we're talking about community, I think you need to be face to face with the other people. You need to engage in real time.
Exactly. I think there was one thing is the pleasure and maybe sexual attraction, and the other is the self-organization. Perhaps for that you need to be occasionally moving around the same spaces with people, engaging to see what's wrong with those spaces, or to see how the environment is, and therefore to be activated to make changes. So I think one thing is, definitely the dating apps.
I mean, I think it is an important part of the picture, and it is something which has changed in the last few years. But saying that, I think also in some of the media discussion around some of the venues which are closing, sometimes it's come across maybe that, people don't want to spend time in these spaces because they can, meet digitally or whatever. But really, when you look down into the detail, when we were working, for example, with Ben Walters at the RVT Future campaign, a campaign to save Royal Vauxhall Tavern, which is really much loved by many people.
I remember that campaign.
Yes, and he's just over there in the adjacent room. And what we found is that the reality was very different. It wasn't that people didn't want to use the space because they could meet digitally wherever they wanted. It was a much loved, really well attended, profitable space. And a kind of Austrian property developer wanted to change it into a hotel. So the story is sometimes more complex than just this factor.
No, absolutely.
It's what happened with privatization in general.
Yes.
Profitable places, businesses, organizations close for the sake of
It's what happens
liberal
with
politics.
trains in this country as well. So you don't have to go very far.
Trains and venues. They are venues in their own
But
right.
also I wanted to say something which is, we tend to, this exhibition is not want to present the LGBTQ community as the saints and everybody else as the bad guys who shut down those spaces. Because I think, in part, the LGBTQ community, with the big pound that we mentioned earlier, have been instrumental in the gentrification of certain areas as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that is something that should be mentioned. So there's no clear boundaries and there's no good and bad cup here.
No, absolutely. And also, acknowledge the fact that LGBTQ plus communities is formed by all different individuals, and many of whom may work for developers and banks and financial. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
there's always elements of class, and there's always elements of ethnic discrimination or whatever.
Cultural values,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The Scandinavian artist Elm Green and Draxet said during the media preview of that show here, the Whitechapel Gallery, that spaces that have been historically popular amongst gay men for sexual encounters and socializing are becoming increasingly sanitized and gentrified. And I remember one of them mentioning parks and public toilets during the media preview as a direct provocation to perhaps I would call bourgeois, sort of bourgeois Puritanism. In fact, they noted how property development in London may be contributing to changes in spaces and culture. Do you think neoliberal capitalism is threatening the existence of such spaces, or do you rather think that gay men are gradually integrating into or conforming to heteronormative social spaces? Do you think it's a combination of both?
You should go first.
Well, I think this is a very important point again, and but I think it is a complex picture. I think there is a need for LGBTQ plus spaces. I mean, I think perhaps for certain groups within that spectrum who may be financially better off or who have greater access to resources, it's okay. It's not such a big deal. But spaces are kind of so crucially important as a kind of networking place, spaces to self-organize, to campaign, and the kind of spatial aspect is really key, I think.
I think I'd like to underline here the title of the exhibition, which is Queer Spaces. So we're not just talking about LGBTQ plus spaces, we're talking about queer, and the way we use queer is also how it has come to be understood through sociology and queer theory as something that disrupts the dominant hegemonic model. So your sexuality doesn't necessarily disrupt that. So we shouldn't be judging it based on that. But then I think it's what Cameron earlier mentioned about this notion of activism and collaboration and willingness to engage and to understand other people that can probably shift your perspective a little bit. And then maybe you can realize how other people in your city feel like.
Right. Obviously, some of the works here deal with what Draxet and Elm Green had said, what I've just mentioned. I'd like to point out the work by Prem Sahib, which is absolutely great, which is a replica of an original that was decorating chariots, which was a gay sauna in Shoreditch, and he managed to photograph all the space because he had a friend who was a squatter there, who managed to let him in, and he photographed the whole space. And he managed to get hold of the original lockers, which he actually exhibited the Cultural Institute in Hamburg. So I think a lot of artists are dealing with these topics of sanitizing places for
I mean, I suppose the main
sexuality.
question is what is happening to our cultural landscape, and I suppose that's what Elm and Draxet are addressing. And this is what we are addressing with this exhibition as well.
Yeah, and I think it's the first exhibition that really doesn't look into queer identity as such, but looks into that combination of how space is enforced psychologically as well through the individual. For instance, I'm just looking now as I'm talking to you, Ralph Dunn's public toilets.
Yeah, I love that.
They're incredibly powerful because seemingly they are very objective. Have an objective sort of viewpoint, the angle of the camera, but then they are so heavily psychologically enforced with that flash shining on the surface. And there's other works that Prem showed us, we couldn't include them in the show, where There's the reflections on the tiles in public toilets. You see them as a viewer, perhaps you just quickly pass the point, but he was saying that's how, your face is reflected on them, perhaps when you're in there, yes. Or other things you see through the reflections of the tile. And I think this is an important element that the works bring, but in a very quiet way.
Right.
And that is not going to be
subjective.
Subjective way, absolutely, and that's also important. And it's addressed within the artworks, not within our, the case studies or just our curatorial methodology, but the works bring that, and I think that's an important element, which only space can do. Yes. Social media do not have this haptic understanding of space, yes. And Shoe Mirror, Tom Bears is also, I think, very interestingly linked with that concept of identity within space.
And talking about space, also the gallery space, it's important that you come here and experience these works. Because if you see them on reproduction, it's a different thing. You might think the exhibition is about something else. But when you are actually here and you are in front of that tombour piece where you see your legs or other people's, and that piece is activated and it feels like there is some sort of presence or something going on, but you can't see the faces. And I think that's quite interesting. Or when you're in front of that body ideal, which has been imposed on us by the media, And I
think the Tom Bear piece is strategically, in a way, we looked how it suits to be placed in the exhibition, but it's very important for what you said. It doesn't allow you to forget yourself within the space. You are a viewer, and you don't just lose yourself within a museum. You are actually part of that environment. You are a producer as well of what you see in your own way. So I think that's very important.
Was it hard for you to select the works of art by all these artists? How was the criteria?
Yes, it was hard because we had they produce some amazing works, yes. And we have been following their work for a long time. So yes, it was hard because obviously we have the limitations of the space and they're very real limitations.
But it was also
as well.
very easy, I would say, because we were very much in tune, which was incredible because we've never worked together before. So we had a wide selection of artists as well. We had artists who we invited, they didn't in the end, we had other works, but I think because we all knew what we wanted, it was easy in the end to go for the particular works, I felt, in this way.
So some of the works would have been commissioned just for the show, or they were
Not necessarily, but they just didn't happen as we had them initially in mind. And we think that the number of artists we have in the show is fine for what we wanted to do. They're London-based as well, in the majority.
And add something that we have also queered the gallery space, in the sense that we have a piece by Prem that is only shown at night, as you walk outside the gallery in the evening. So sometimes you can get the vibe of the gallery, because a lot of people they're a bit skeptical or self-intimidated, self-conscious or whatever. They don't want to.
They have to pay. Also, people don't know that it's free.
So we're really interested in that, in creating that situationist moment where you're just trying to get a bus, and all of a sudden you see the lights coming on outside the building in that particular gallery, and you're like, oh, what's that? What's going on? So we really wanted to activate that inside and outside the space.
So you instigate the potential audience member to come in. And to play with the boundaries of what is an institution and what are the...
And what is an artwork. Because you may see the flag there and you may think it's an artwork. It does come from two artists. It's from their collection, but it's what was outside Joiner's Arms. So is it an artwork? Is it a remnant? Is it an archival piece? What is it? Has it become? So we like to do that anyway.
And the viewer has to decide at the end of the day whether they think this is a memento, whether it's it's a remnant, or whether it's an artwork, and that's fine.
I just think it's absolutely extraordinary that these objects, and some of which I have seen when I would go to the Joiners, for instance, many years ago, and obviously Prem's piece from Chariots, they were objects with a particular purpose before, and now they're being elevated into art.
Yeah, so recontextualize
Yeah.
completely. Yeah.
Contextualize, yeah.
And there's also really interesting engagement with the archive material. I guess as you were talking about this kind of idea of queering the gallery space. So in particular working with Evan Ifekoya, who has worked looking at the Ruckus Black LGBT archive. And Evan's created artwork kind of reassembling this material with their own collage elements, and is also contributing a sound work that kind of comes on as you enter the space, which kind of introduces multiple different voices discussing experience of nightlife, which I think for me is one of the highlights of the exhibition.
Leading on to our last question here. So amongst the LGBTQ plus venues that are disappearing, they've noted an increasing number of venues dedicated to lesbian women and black LGBTQ plus audience. The report points out that, in observing that the nightlife spaces were far from perfect, respondents to the survey remarked on a specific exclusionary aspects including racism, classism, ableism, sexism, transphobia and homophobia. Why do you think we are still so tribal as human beings within a community that as a whole has fought so much discrimination, violence and prejudice? I'd like to sort of have your thoughts on it. It's a quite interesting issue related to discrimination within.
Normally any phobia, as the word says, comes from fear. The fear you're threatened. And I think that creates vulnerability in how you relate to other people in general, and perhaps within the community at times when these segregations had appeared or manifested themselves within at least the research that we have encountered, perhaps they came from such insecurities in a way, as it always happens even in other social sort of groups, or you have countries who were formed very few years ago, but they still have a very strong nationalist agenda, although they just 100 years ago they were spread into 50 tribes, and I'm from Greece, I speak about my country. So these are very interesting, in a way, connections. How we become so
sense of security.
Yeah, it is. It's actually
we hang out.
Yeah,
we get on
and you're
well
threatened
with people
by
who
the
look like
other.
us.
Flock.
Yeah,
Yes.
You're threatened by the other, whoever that other is.
So even though
as
that
long as
may be
it's not-
a lesbian black woman, still obviously part of the wider LGBTQ plus community, we're fighting against the same.
Well, in Berlin,
Should
there's more than one prides. So the people who are radically left-wing, and they don't really accept of the commodification of pride, so they have their own pride. And then there's other people that feel that this is not representing them in terms of race, so they have their own pride. And I think here in this, last year we had Black Pride, and it's got, Also, last year, I thought that was outrageous in the sense that how can this happen and that problematizes me about the community itself, because I come from that community and I'm really interested in where things are going. Gay women were abusing trans women during Pride. So yes, so I thought that was
at the very beginning.
Yes, the beginning of the parade. Yeah, so that was interesting. So I don't really have an answer to your question, although I have been thinking about it and I'm still thinking about it. But my question, I suppose that's something that I'm putting out there with the exhibition, is how come LGBTQ plus people are more accepted now? They're widely accepted. They can have children. They can do things the way heterosexual people can, and that's what they wanted. And we have this bigotry and this harassment and also this phobia that we hadn't seen, since the Stonewall fights, protests.
But I think it's a really important point, and I think something which we should acknowledge is that some of these some of the spaces, LGBTQ plus spaces or queer spaces in London, have not always been inclusive to everyone, and they can sometimes be exclusive places. And I think what is interesting particularly about some of the case studies that we looked at is we tried to find examples where people were doing things a little bit differently and where there were some exceptions to that. In particular, the Friends of the Joiners Arms, for example, they're having to address these questions very actively about how to create a space which is accessible to as many people as possible when they are campaigning for the new space, which will be part of a new development. And then also case studies like the Glass Bar, which is one of the few examples of an LGBTQ plus venue run by a woman of colour and which was inclusive well, it was a women-only space, but also inclusive of trans people and non-binary people. So we found it was very important to kind of find those examples where things were done kind of differently in the exhibition and to kind of challenge that.
It's also very interesting from a very quick look around, just from the flyers that certain venues were produced, they made sure that whether they were open to everybody or not, that was addressed in a casual way in the flyer, and that's in a way to say there's a flyer, I think it's one, it says open to women and their male guests. So as long as you were invited, you wanted to go with a man there, it was all right. Perhaps otherwise it wasn't okay. And I think there are differences in how they all addressed their openness or not. Yeah.
I just want to say one thing, sort of following up what Cameron said earlier about collaboration and inclusivity right now, that the exhibition is very much about that. So it's also about, it's not about the fading of these spaces and what happens, all doom and gloom. It's also about the potential of creating other spaces that are inclusive, and they are much more fluid, and they are also hugely influential to communities.
I hope there will be political will from local authorities and national government to ensure that, first of all, these spaces don't continue to die out, and that the new creative spaces will appear as well as a counter kind of movement.
I think it also depends on creative people, and I think creative people are very much on board.
Well, I'm delighted. Nayia, Vassilios and Cameron, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thank you for your interest.
Thank you.